But that's how you're fully gifted in something. And God has placed deep passions in your heart somewhere. And as we walk through these weeks together, we're going to figure out, what is your gifting? What is your passion? And how can you be so fully alive that God gets maximal glory because of your calling? Let's move then to the first chapter, and then let me have you guys discuss this question here too. As you may recall reading, the first chapter is Everything is Everything. So here's the question I want to ask. If you remember, I'm kind of referring to my my mentor who teaches at Biola University. He says this: worship is everything, and everything is worship. Powerful thoughts. It's not just Christianese. Can you guys, in 2 minutes, have conversation, break down what that really means? Because they're not saying the same thing, right? They're a little bit slightly different, a little bit nuanced here. So what does it mean that worship is everything? And then what does it mean to say that everything is worship? You guys okay? So take like 2 minutes, discuss with your neighbor what those two things mean. Okay? Worship is everything. What is that? Let's go with the first part, because it sounds like the same thing, but it's not. So worship is everything. What does that mean? Any thoughts? Worship is everything. George.
Meaning everything is what drives us. What drives us in life.
Yes.
What drives us to wake up in the morning.
Yes.
Have a spiritual awakening. Everything that drives us spiritually.
Okay, good. Excellent. It drives the whole of our lives, right? On the radio, I heard this movie critic go like, the cinematography was okay, the acting was but the script was everything. What's he saying? It's not literally everything, because you have to still act it out and film it and whatever, right? But it saved, it meant, it's the point of the whole movie, right? It's what saved the movie. It is the movie, so to speak, right? So worship is the point of our lives, right? That's the whole purpose for our existence. Now, that was great, George. On the flip side, anyone, what about everything is worship? Literally taken, everything is worship. Okay, Tim, and then Kayla.
It's like no matter what you're doing, you're worshiping something. So
Okay.
Try to make sure you're worshiping the right thing.
Okay, great. And when you say no matter what, let's get real brass tacks. What are some examples of that? Or Kayla? Yeah, go ahead, continue.
When you were talking about it, I gave the example of like, it doesn't matter if you're like walking from one class to another,
Yep.
or if you're like playing on the NBA All-Star basketball
Yep.
team and like showing that you're giving praise to God to a camera.
Yeah.
If you're doing it well and you're doing it in the way that God desires, then you're doing it properly in worship.
That's excellent. So, literally, like homemaking, as it's called, to walking to the library, to filling up your gas tank, or using the electric one if you have a Tesla or whatever, those are acts of worship. Everything from filling up gas, right, to filming a movie, to preaching a sermon and listening to one, every one of these things are acts of worship. Everything we do is an act of worship. So let me give you this thought. Blaise Pascal, a lot of us know him because he's just a genius and he worked with all kinds of math and physics and what have you, but he was a devout follower of the Lord. And here's what he said. He said, make Christianity attractive, make good men and women wish it were true, and then show that it is. Right? Make Christianity attractive. Make your life sing so that there's worship going on when you're doing NGO work in Africa. Make your life sing so that when you're doing NGO work in Africa, it's also a witness. So it's a witness and a worship. And so I'll just give you a quick example of this. Let me just read it for us. This gentleman, his name is Matthew Paris. I still think he might still be an atheist. But here's what he wrote. He said, now a confirmed atheist, I've been convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism makes in Africa. He was actually born in Africa, moved to England, but then when he visited Malawi in particular, his hometown, he said, wait a second, we're still in poverty, what's going on? And then he noticed how Christian evangelism is doing work that far exceeds some secular NGOs and all that. Here's what he says. He says, sharply distinct from the work of secular NGOs, government projects, and international aid efforts. These alone will not do. Education and training alone will not do. In Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. So in an article he wrote entitled, "As an Atheist, I Truly Believe Africa Needs God," this is Christian evangelism and NGO work done in the world of poverty that is making Christianity attractive. Now your work can be witness and it can be worship, right? So if that's true, let me ask you this question. Doesn't it make sense that we would do everything that we possibly could to be the most excellent, I don't know, NGO worker or whatever space we're talking about? But here's the problem. If you're so good at what you do, right, whether it is to be in the NBA or whatever, wouldn't you be robbing God of his glory? Does that make sense? Like, wait a second, what if you are so stellar that people keep pointing to you and they forget about anything about God because you're like a God in the NBA or you're like a God in whatever field? Wouldn't God's glory be robbed a bit? Alexa.
Well, I think that's when you take the phrase, give the glory to God, like literally, because like the glory is given to you because of what people see, but then it's your decision of whether or not like you give God the credit for blessing.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent. So you could steal it if you wanted to, or you can actually give the proper praise to God because he's the one who gave you the gift in the first place, right? So that's great. Let me give you a quick 1-minute video of how, you know, a hip hop artist who is doing pretty well and how his producer JR, the guy you'll see at the end is his producer but also a pastor. That's why I think he's very theologically informed, but also kind of making it he's putting it in a quite neat way. So have a look here.
All right, so I had an idea for a song.
Yeah.
Called Paganini. There was a violin player back in the day, Paganini. He was such a monster on the violin and strings, like that his strings would pop when he was playing, and people thought he was possessed by the devil because he would play so fast.
Yeah.
Sheer showing off.
Yeah.
Is that like all it was? Why are you looking like that?
How does that not become a vain?
Yeah.
Vanity?
How does that not become
a
vain?
song of vanity? Yeah.
Well, I'm demonstrating the gifts that the Lord's given. That's it, dog. That's it.
And you can just get ill, like
Just get ill and then just be like
Control.
I'll be ill.
It's like the church musician ODing on something, but there's a space, a solo, when it's like, yo, now you need to show out.
When you go to a piano recital, I mean, you practice. You gonna see like a 12-year-old Phnom kid play. You're seeing him show off. Like he's playing pieces that he loves, but he's killing it. And we get up and we clap because we all know where the gift comes from.
Being excellent in it is actually the best way to give God glory. Does that make sense? Here's how a 2nd century saint, not Andy and his producer, but Saint Irenaeus, he said the glory of, and that's why I put it in such huge font, because this to me is like, it frames so much of calling. He said the glory of God is not Vanguard University Chapel, although obviously God is glorified there. Right? He even said the glory of God is not our Sunday worship service. He said the glory of God is humanity fully alive. And you are fully alive, I believe, when you are in your gifting and within your passion serving God's purposes. Your G.P.S, right? We'll talk about that soon. But that's how you're fully gifted in something. And God has placed deep passions in your heart somewhere. And as we walk through these weeks together, we're going to figure out what is your gifting? What is your passion? And how can you be so fully alive that God gets maximal glory because of your calling? Some of you guys probably saw it on like Instagram, Facebook, maybe you shared it, but kind of a cool thing, right? The Christian shoemaker does his duty not by putting little crosses on shoes, right? But by making good shoes. Sounds like a very like really cool way of thinking about work as worship, right? Like, you know, but look, in and out, under the cup, right? Bible verses, Forever 21, verses under the bag, right? So maybe there is a place for that, right? But it seems Luther is saying, even if we didn't do that and just made really good shoes, shirts, films, without putting, you know, like a subliminal John 3:16 on every film that you make, even if you don't do that, you just make it well and you're giving God glory. Now here's the problem with this quote. Luther actually never said that. It's a great thought, but he didn't say that. But here is what he did say that comes close. Luther said, it's pure invention that Pope, Bishop, and priests are called the spiritual estate, while princes, lords and artisans or engineers or doctors or elementary school teachers are called a temporal or secular estate. He says all Christians are truly of the spiritual estate, and there is no difference between them. The rest of the quote is, except that of office. We're just called to different places to fill. And all of it is spiritual work, as long as you do it well, right? Okay, so that's Luther. Moving on. Any questions so far? Okay, here's Hall, an English Puritan pastor. I thought he had something very interesting to say. It's very old English, but the takeaway is it's beautiful. The homeliest service, so this is like old English, okay? The homeliest service that we do in an honest calling, there it is, though it be to plow or dig, if done in obedience and conscience of God's commandment, is crowned with ample reward, right? Like we can plow or dig and give glory to God. Now here's the rest of it. Whereas the best works of their kind, like we Christians would say the best thing you can do is preach, pray, offering evangelical sacrifices, right? Like going on missions. Oh, that's the best work, he says, supposedly. If it's without respect of God's injunction, like his instruction for our life, and if it's not to his glory, are loaded with curses. Some strong language. Like, in other words, if you're not called to missions or preaching, and you do that, it's that's a strong way of putting it. It's loaded with curses. There's a seminary prof who actually will take his students through his class and ask them to preach a sermon, and when they do, and if it's not nearly going to make anyone blessed, to put it that way, he does the hard job of actually saying to them, I think you should quit seminary. Like he will say it, right? I mean, he's prayerful about it, and like he's a little bit tactful. But actually, if you think about it, he's saving them and their future congregations a whole lot of heartache. I mean, Hall would say it a little bit more strongly. But if we're out, in other words, it was Agnes's, right? Mother Teresa's calling to go to Calcutta and serve the poorest of the poor. It may not be your calling. If she weren't to go, it would be disobedience. If you're like, but I want to be a super Christian and I'm going to go, but actually you were supposed to be a CEO who could fund 5,000 other, are you with me on that? That's also loaded with curses, as Hall would say. Now here's the best part of this quote. He says, God loveth adverbs. And we're like, when did this become a grammar class, right? God loveth adverbs. What does he mean? God cares not how good. Missions is good, supposedly, better than engineering. Are you with me? He cares not how good, but how well, right? Let me give you a quick example of this. A friend of mine, Carlin, he worked for a financial advising firm for many years, 10 years, in fact. It's a famous building. You guys would recognize it in San Francisco, but he was in Vancouver, Canada. 10 years he worked at this firm. Shared an office space with 5 other managers. He was a manager too, the 6 of them in these offices. All 5 of his co-workers, managers, they became Christian through the course of these 10 years. Every single one of these 5 people would credit Carlin for their journey toward conversion. Now, what's interesting is the 5th person to get saved, the last one, he literally showed up at Carlin's church. We'll just call him John. And John and his wife show up, and Carlin goes, John, what are you doing here? And John says, I don't know. My wife and I woke up this morning feeling like we had to come to church. I called Rob to find out where you were, and so here we are, right? And so, okay, sure, come on over, let's worship. And they had service, and then he joined the Alpha group, and over the course of 6 months, he became saved. So all 5 of his co-workers became saved. Now, here's the most interesting part. Every one of them credits Carlin for their journey toward Christ, but Carlin would say that he never witnessed to a single one of those individuals. What he did instead is he financially advised well, didn't steal office supplies, and just was an incredible coworker to these 5 managers. Every single one of them, though, would say, it's because of Carlin I'm a Christian. Right? There's something about doing things well that God cares deeply about, and you would do things well if you're in your calling. Right? Last quote from Kuyper, and here's what he says. Kuyper, I'll tell you kind of a little bit about it here in a second, but check out his quote. There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, And Abraham Kuyper, if you can just look at his sort of, I don't know, list of CV or whatever, you can see that he actually kind of lived it out, right? He actually did believe that the Lord is Lord over all things, and this is who he was almost a century ago. But Kuyper lived it out. And I guess the question for us in the next sort of weeks together is, what is that, so to speak, square inch over which or into which God has called you? Because that square inch is a calling too, and it's a place in which God can get glory.